across parts of the American South something strange began happening. Entire groups of feral hogs, sometimes 30 or 40 animals at a time, were vanishing. Not just a few stragglers. Whole sounders disappeared from counties in Texas, Georgia, and Oklahoma where they had dominated the land for decades. Wildlife officials were baffled. Hunters hadn't reported kills. Traps sat untouched. Yet the animals were simply gone. So what was happening out there in the brush? Was it disease? A new predator? Or something far more unexpected? That mystery triggered an unusual investigation. In 2014, researchers working in Blanco County set up dozens of trail cameras across hog-infested areas. The goal was simple: capture evidence of whatever was killing these animals. 3 weeks later, the team returned and pulled the memory cards. What they found was so surprising that they shut down the entire monitoring site within 2 days. Not because they were in danger, but because the discovery was too important to risk disturbing. To understand why this footage shocked researchers, you first have to understand the scale of the feral hog problem. These animals were never supposed to exist in North America. The story begins more than 5 centuries ago. In the 1500s, Spanish explorers sailing along the Gulf Coast released domestic pigs into the wilderness as a living food supply. Those pigs survived, reproduced, and spread inland. Then, in the early 1900s, European hunters imported Eurasian wild boars into the country for sport. Escaped domestic pigs bred with those boars, producing a hybrid that was stronger, faster, and smarter than either ancestor. Today, that hybrid is one of the most destructive invasive animals in the United States. In Texas alone, roughly 2.6 million live across almost the entire state. Imagine an animal that can sprint over 30 miles per hour, that has 6-inch tusks capable of slicing through flesh, an animal strong enough to break wooden doors and leap over 4-foot fences. Now imagine millions of them. Farmers and landowners face that reality every day. In suburban neighborhoods like Irving, manicured lawns and golf courses have been ripped apart. At a military airfield, takeoffs were once canceled because a group charged across the runway at dawn. A Williamson County farmer lost more than $40,000 in corn after a single nighttime raid. In one study, researchers at Texas A&M University estimated annual damage costs in the hundreds of millions in Texas and billions nationwide. How does a species this destructive keep multiplying despite decades of hunting, trapping, and government programs? The answer lies in biology and behavior. A female hog can produce 2 litters a year, up to a dozen piglets each, do the math, and populations explode. The animals learn quickly. They remember traps, timing, and places. They adapt. So when whole sounders began disappearing, it felt like the ecological ground was shifting. Hunters and ranchers asked, could there be an epidemic? Poachers? Or something else entirely? Back to those trail cameras in Blanco County. When researchers reviewed the footage, they saw a predator no one had considered. A 30-pound coyote attacking hog nests. At first, scientists assumed it was a rare accident. But the cameras kept recording, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. The predator was coyote, an animal most Americans associate with scavenging or hunting small prey. Yet the footage showed something far more complex: coyotes organizing coordinated raids on hog nests. They approached silently from downwind, staying low in the grass. Then they waited. The team that found the footage weren't anonymous faces on a grant form. They were people who'd grown up around the land and carried the kind of quiet obsession that keeps you awake chewing on data until morning. The lead scientist on the project was Dr. Maya Singh, a woman who had spent her 20s following collared coyotes across dusty ranch roads and learning the language of tracks. Her field technician, Jonah Reed, had hands calloused from long nights setting cameras and a laugh that could break the tension in a field lab. They had argued for months about the best places to place cameras. She favored ridgelines where wind patterns gave scent advantage. He preferred low ravines where hogs wallowed. Together they watched the clips in a makeshift tent that smelled of coffee and boot leather. On the small laptop screen, the first clip was unremarkable: a sow nursing in a shallow depression, piglets asleep against her flanks. Then, from the shrubs, a ripple of motion. A coyote slipped forward, then another, then 4. They spread out like a small military unit and skulked toward the nest. One drew the sow's attention with a sudden bark. The others dashed in, scooped piglets and retreated before the sow could fully respond. They weren't simply opportunistic scavengers. They were performing tactics: diversion, isolation, rapid strike. Over days the pattern repeated at nests all over the property. The coyotes struck in the pre-dawn hours, when the hogs were less vigilant, and they took the young. When piglets disappeared from a litter, the sow's behavior changed. She began to abandon that den, retrace past routes, and eventually the family group fractured. Over time, with successive litters lost and sounders splintered, entire family units vanished from the landscape. Was it possible that this predator, long dismissed as a nuisance, was quietly exerting a new kind of ecological pressure, one that could alter hog population dynamics on a regional scale? If so, could those pressure points be harnessed as a form of natural control against an invasive pest without resorting to more destructive human measures? These questions hummed in the tent long after the battery on the laptop died. But there were other, more immediate worries. If word of the footage leaked, what would happen? Ranchers, desperate and hurt from years of crop damage, might retaliate and target coyotes en masse. Government agencies might try to intervene with culling programs that would rip apart the very community behavior researchers wanted to understand. Dr. Singh and Jonah argued in low tones about whether to publish the findings immediately. He wanted to take the footage to a sympathetic local paper and let the public know. She insisted on more careful study, on genetic tests and more cameras to track whether the behavior was localized or spreading. Why would a species known for being solitary and opportunistic suddenly show coordinated, almost ritualized strategy? Was it simply a case of a particularly clever family passing tactics to pups, cultural transmission of technique in the animal kingdom? Or had prolonged exposure to human landscapes and abundant food led coyotes to adopt new hunting repertoires? Over the next months the team did what they could in secret. They expanded camera coverage, placed non-invasive scent stations to test olfactory learning, tagged a few coyotes with GPS collars under the cover of night. They noticed something else. The leading animals in these raids were often older, scarred individuals, coyotes with a history of close encounters and survival. One female, tracked by a collar and nicknamed Sable by the crew because of her mottled pelt, appeared in clip after clip, orchestrating the moves like a general pointing at the map. She had a limp from a trap injury, but that limp did not slow her. If anything, it added to her gravitas. Sable became the mystery at the heart of the study. How could a single coyote, and presumably her extended family, exert such outsized influence on an invasive species that had overwhelmed entire counties? Was this an isolated natural experiment, or the first sign of a wider shift in predator behavior across the region? All of this raised an uncomfortable thought. Humans had created the hog problem. Could an unanticipated non-human solution be emerging, one that required humans to stop fighting and start protecting a predator we had historically persecuted? And if so, what would that mean for the communities that had suffered the most? The research team published nothing for months, and when they finally wrote a cautious, peer-reviewed paper, they framed their findings as evidence of coordinated predation on young feral hogs by coyote family groups, rather than the more sensational claim that coyotes were collapsing hog populations. They asked more questions than they answered. How common was this behavior? Could it scale up? What were the unintended consequences of tipping predator-prey balances in human-dominated landscapes? Meanwhile, word leaked anyway. A rancher who'd seen his neighbor's hog population thin called a meeting. Hunters, ecologists, and livestock producers crowded a county hall and argued in the low, urgent tones of people who live close to both land and loss. What could be more threatening than an animal that both destroys and vanishes? Was this a cause for celebration or alarm? Those debates went to the heart of a larger question. When nature begins to correct a human-made problem in an unpredictable way, do we step back and watch, or do we insert ourselves to guide the outcome? Do we trust a scarred, limping female coyote to know what's best for a landscape our species has already reshaped so thoroughly? Dr. Singh often thought about the strange responsibility that came with watching the wild so closely. Most nights she sat alone beside a folding table outside the small research trailer, carefully wiping dust from camera lenses while the sky above Texas unfolded into a blanket of cold, bright stars. Coyotes howled somewhere beyond the fields, their voices echoing across dry grass and shallow ravines. To many people those sounds meant nuisance animals. To her, they sounded like questions waiting to be answered. Her work had always blurred the boundary between scientist and storyteller. Every frame captured by the motion cameras was more than data. It was a moment in an unfolding narrative about strategy, survival, and consequence. Each clip raised new mysteries. Each observation hinted that the natural world might be more inventive than humans ever imagined. And lately, the cameras had begun telling a story no one expected. The footage that changed everything. The first video arrived late one night. Jonah, her research partner, had been reviewing memory cards when he suddenly stopped scrolling. "Sing, you need to see this." On the screen, illuminated in grainy infrared light, a group of coyotes stood at the edge of a brushy clearing. Just beyond them lay a shallow depression in the dirt, a feral hog nest. Inside the nest, several piglets slept in a tight cluster. But something about the coyotes' behavior was unusual. They weren't charging recklessly like predators chasing prey. They were waiting. For nearly an hour. The target, they soon realized, was never the adult hog. That would have been suicide. A mother feral hog can weigh more than 200 pounds, and when defending her young she becomes one of the most dangerous animals in North America. Coyotes knew this well. Instead, they waited for something else. They waited for the moment when the mother left. Eventually the sow stood, sniffed the air, and wandered away to forage among the nearby grasses. That was when everything changed. The coyotes moved with sudden precision. One animal remained behind as a lookout, scanning the darkness. Another crept closer to the nest. Then, without warning, the attack happened. 3 coyotes rushed in simultaneously. One grabbed a piglet by the neck. Within seconds the group vanished into the darkness. Total time of the attack: 5 seconds. By the time the mother hog turned around, confused and angry, the predators were already gone. Jonah replayed the clip several times in silence. "Did they just coordinate that?" he finally asked. Dr. Singh leaned closer to the screen. "That wasn't random," she said quietly. "That was strategy. A pattern emerges." At first the researchers thought it might be a rare coincidence. But over the following weeks, more footage arrived. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. Coyotes waiting, observing, planning, then striking. Sometimes they approached a nest slowly, studying the mother's behavior before retreating. Later they returned from a different direction, almost like scouts mapping the terrain. Even more surprising, some coyotes appeared to conduct what looked like practice runs. They approached nests without attacking, then withdrew. Why rehearse unless they were learning? Could coyotes actually be developing a systematic method for hunting piglets? If so, how widespread was this behavior? And perhaps more importantly, how long had it been happening without anyone noticing? These questions kept the researchers awake at night. Nature's unexpected solution. Ecologists eventually began piecing together a possible explanation. For decades, human development had steadily reduced many of the coyotes' traditional food sources. Expanding cities, highways, and farms disrupted populations of rabbits, ground nesting birds, and other small animals coyotes once relied upon. But while those food sources shrank, another species exploded. Feral hogs. Across the southern United States their population surged into the millions. Every spring, enormous numbers of piglets were born. A sudden abundance of vulnerable prey. Coyotes, masters of adaptation, responded. They adjusted their hunting schedules to dawn, when mother hogs were most exhausted after a night of feeding. At that moment their reaction time slowed. Their awareness dropped. Coyotes exploited that weakness. And the numbers suggested it worked. In several regions of Texas, piglet deaths caused by coyotes doubled within a decade. Parts of Oklahoma and Georgia even reported measurable declines in feral hog populations. Think about that for a moment. A predator weighing barely 30 pounds was slowing the growth of an invasive species that could reach 300 pounds. And it was doing so without a single taxpayer dollar. Could nature have quietly developed its own solution to a problem humans had struggled with for decades? The complication no one expected. But the story didn't end there. Because while coyotes were adapting to control hog populations, humans were unknowingly interfering. Between 2017 and 2020, several states launched aggressive coyote bounty programs. Hunters were paid up to $75 for each animal killed. The idea seemed simple. Fewer coyotes meant safer livestock. Thousands of animals were removed. Yet few officials had asked a crucial question. What happens to feral hog populations when their piglet predators disappear? The answer arrived faster than anyone expected. In one Texas county, coyote numbers dropped by more than 60%. Within 3 years, the feral hog population tripled. Every piglet that coyotes once removed now survived. Those piglets grew into adults. Those adults produced more piglets. Soon farmers who once saw declining hog damage began reporting massive infestations again. Entire fields were torn apart overnight. Corn crops vanished. Pastures looked like they had been plowed by bulldozers. Some wildlife scientists described the situation bluntly. By removing coyotes, humans had accidentally eliminated the only natural system slowing the hog explosion. Was the ecosystem trying to correct the problem all along? And had humans unknowingly disrupted that balance? Rethinking the strategy. Once officials saw the data, strategies began to change. Wildlife managers began acknowledging something many ranchers had long suspected. No single method could solve the feral hog crisis. Instead, a layered approach was needed. One of the most promising tools became the modern, smart trap. These large enclosures combine cameras, solar panels, and wireless transmitters. Farmers can monitor the traps remotely through smartphone apps. But the technology works only if used carefully. Feral hogs travel in groups called sounders. If a trap closes too early, catching only a few animals, the survivors quickly learn to avoid traps entirely. So farmers now wait. They watch live footage. And when the entire group enters, sometimes 20 or 30 animals, they trigger the trap remotely. In one instant, the entire sounder is captured. The reproductive cycle stops. The damage ends. The traps can cost thousands of dollars. But many farmers recover that investment after preventing just one destroyed crop. Helicopter hunting is also used in areas where dense forests and swamps make trapping impossible. Yet despite all the new technology, experts now agree on something surprising. Coyotes remain one of the most valuable allies in the fight against feral hogs. Without them, piglet survival skyrockets. And the population surges again. The lesson hidden in the wild. For more than a century, humans treated coyotes as enemies. They were poisoned, trapped, shot on sight. The assumption was simple: predators cause problems. But the cameras scattered across those quiet fields had begun telling a different story. Coyotes were not just surviving human expansion. They were adapting to it. Learning from it, even reshaping their behavior in response to the ecological chaos humans had created. Dr. Singh often found herself thinking about that while watching the footage late at night. What else might animals be learning? What other strategies were unfolding beyond the reach of cameras? How many ecological solutions already existed in nature, solutions humans had overlooked or destroyed? The ethical puzzle. Of course, the discovery also raised difficult questions. Encouraging coyotes could help control hog populations. But coyotes are still predators. They sometimes attack small livestock. Occasionally they even threaten pets. How should farmers and conservationists balance those risks? Should coyotes be protected because they help manage an invasive species? Or should human communities continue trying to control them? And what happens if coyote populations grow too large? Every answer seemed to create new uncertainties. That was why Dr. Singh and Jonah kept asking questions. Not to delay action, but to make sure whatever policies emerged from their research would do more good than harm. A bigger mystery. The cameras still tell an ambiguous tale. Coyotes have clearly discovered a niche they never fully occupied before. Their tactics show patience, cooperation, and adaptation rarely documented in such detail. But will this behavior spread across larger regions? Will other coyote populations learn the same hunting strategy? Or could the behavior disappear as quickly as it emerged? The truth is, no one knows. And that uncertainty might be the most fascinating part of the entire story. Because ecosystems are not static systems. They are living conversations. Humans shape them. Animals respond. Those responses reshape the landscape again. Over time, entirely new relationships emerge. The question that remains. Late at night, when the last data files finish uploading and the coyotes' distant howls echo across the dark prairie, Dr. Singh sometimes thinks about the final question hanging over their research. If wild animals can reorganize their behavior so quickly in response to human-created change, what does that say about the resilience of the ecosystems we live in? Are they stronger than we assume? Or more unpredictable than we're prepared for? And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, who will ultimately write the next chapter of this landscape? Will it be us, with our policies, technologies, and management plans? Or will it be the quiet inhabitants of the wild, adapting in ways we're only beginning to understand? Maybe the real challenge is not controlling nature. Maybe it's learning how to listen to it. So here's a final question worth thinking about. If nature sometimes develops its own solutions to problems humans create, how many answers might already exist around us, waiting quietly in the dark, just beyond the reach of our cameras?